There is a mystery, hidden from the foundation of the world, a sacred calling, ancient and eternal. It is the call to become not just a follower of God, not just a believer in Messiah, but something deeper, more intimate, more prophetic, a co-laborer with the Lord. It's not merely a title, it's a destiny, and to understand it we must journey back to the beginning. In the book of Genesis we find the blueprint. God creates man, Adam, from the dust of the earth Adama. Man is formed not to be idle, but to work the garden, to tend and keep it. This is the first commission, the first labor, but it is not man's work alone. It is God's work through man. The garden is not just a plot of land. It is a shadow of the kingdom. From the beginning, mankind was called to be a co-worker in the unfolding purposes of God. But then came the fall, the breaking of fellowship, and the labor turned to toil. Still, the call remained. Thousands of years later, Messiah would come, the Word made flesh. And again he would say, "My Father is always working, and so am I." And now he calls us not just to believe in him, but to walk with him, work with him, carry his yoke, plow his fields, sow his word, reap his harvest. To become a co-laborer, we must first understand the nature of divine labor. God's work is always redemptive. It is always restorative. It's the work of rebuilding ruins, healing the brokenhearted, opening prison doors, proclaiming liberty, and restoring what was lost. It is the work of light breaking through darkness, and if we are to walk with him, our hands must touch what his hands touch, our hearts must break for what breaks his heart. But here is the mystery: God, the omnipotent, does not need our help, yet he chooses to work through us. He calls us not because of our strength, but despite our weakness. He chooses the vessel even if it's cracked, because in the cracks his light shines through. The weak become strong, the foolish confound the wise. Why? Because it's not our strength, but his power made perfect in our weakness. So how do we step into this mystery? How do we become true co-laborers with the Lord? First, we must be willing to surrender. Not just part of our lives, not just the convenient hours, but everything. The fisherman had to drop his net. The tax collector had to leave his booth. The rich man had to let go of what he owned. To co-labor with God, you must let go of your own labor. It's not about your plans, but his purpose. Second, we must tune our spirit to his voice. God's work doesn't come with a roadmap. It comes with a whisper. Elijah didn't find God in the fire or the storm, but in the still, small voice. The co-laborer must walk closely enough to hear that whisper, moment by moment, day by day. Third, we must be willing to go where he goes. The cloud moved and the Israelites moved. The co-laborer doesn't ask God to bless his own path. He walks the path God blesses. Sometimes that path leads to Nineveh, sometimes to the wilderness, sometimes to the cross, but always it leads to life. Fourth, we must labor in love. God's labor is always rooted in love. If we preach without love, serve without love, give without love, it is nothing. But if we love, truly love, then we mirror the heart of the Father. Fifth, we must understand that this labor is eternal. What we do with him, what we build with him, is not temporal. The world fades, but the kingdom remains. Every soul you touch, every seed you plant in his name, it echoes in eternity. And last, there is a sacred joy in this labor. The world labors under the curse, but the children of God labor under grace. We are not striving, we are flowing, we are not pushing. We are being led. This is not burdensome work. It is holy partnership. We sow in tears, but reap in joy. We carry the burden of the cross, but also the power of the resurrection. So I say to you, the call is not to the sidelines. The call is not just to believe, but to build, not just to be saved, but to serve, not just to receive, but to release. The Lord of the harvest is calling, and he is searching for laborers, not just any laborers, but co-laborers. Will you answer? Would you like this speech split into parts or turned into a video script, sermon outline, or social post? From the beginning of time, there has been a divine calling upon humanity, one that was embedded into the very design of creation. In the garden, God formed man from the dust and breathed into him the breath of life. But he didn't simply create man to exist. He created him to act, to move, to tend, to guard, to steward. Adam was placed in the garden not to watch but to work. This reveals the mystery of divine partnership. God could have tended the garden himself, yet he chose to invite man into his work. From the very first breath, humanity was called not just to be a recipient of God's creation, but a participant in his plan. This pattern doesn't fade with the fall. Though sin entered and separated, God's purpose of working through mankind never changed. Throughout the Scriptures, we see this unfolding. Noah built an ark, not because God couldn't, but because God chose to bring about salvation through a willing vessel. Moses lifted his staff and parted the sea not by his power, but by the hand of God working through his obedience. Joshua marched around Jericho, David threw the stone, Elijah called down fire, each moment revealing not the power of man, but the willingness of man to be a vessel of the Almighty. In the Hebrew mindset, the sacred and the practical were never meant to be separated. Labor was not cursed in itself. The curse came through rebellion, but the original intent of labor was holy. To work with God was to be aligned with his nature, to mirror his creativity, his order, his righteousness. This same call is echoed in the New Covenant. Messiah calls his disciples not merely to follow, but to do. He sends them out 2 by 2. He says the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. He doesn't say observers are few or worshipers are few, but laborers. This reveals the heart of God, that he is not only working, but he is calling us to work with him. To become a co-laborer is to be drawn into the very heart of the kingdom. It is to recognize that God is actively redeeming, healing, restoring, and advancing his will, and he chooses to use human vessels to do it. This is the mystery of divine partnership. God, who split the sea and created galaxies, desires to involve us in his purposes, not because he is in need, but because love always invites. The Creator is not lacking in power, but he is abundant in love. He invites because partnership brings transformation, not only to the world, but to the one who partners. To labor with God is to be changed by him, refined by the fire of obedience, molded by the weight of glory. The prophet Amos declares, "Can two walk together unless they agree?" To walk with God is to agree with his ways, his timing, his wisdom, and to labor with him is to step into that agreement with action. It's one thing to hear his voice, it's another to act upon it. True co-laboring is not passive belief, it is active faith. It is when Abraham leaves Ur without knowing the full path. It is when Peter steps out onto the water. It is when the widow gives her last bit of flour to the prophet. All of them could have sat back and said, "God will do what he wills." But instead, they answered the call, stepped into alignment, and became part of the unfolding of divine history. Co-laboring with God means our hands are to be on the plow, our feet moving forward, our hearts sensitive to his leading. There is a mystery hidden in the act of surrender, a principle that appears to contradict the natural mind, but reveals the wisdom of heaven. In the world, surrender is seen as weakness, as defeat, as the end of one's own will. But in the kingdom, surrender is the beginning of divine partnership. The mystery is this: in order to labor with the Lord, you must first stop laboring in your own strength. Before God can work through you, he must first bring you to the place where you are emptied of self. The vessels God uses are not those filled with their own agendas, but those who have laid down their will and embraced his. In the Garden of Gethsemane, the Messiah prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." This is not just the prayer of the Son. It is the model for every son and daughter who would become a co-laborer with the Father. Surrender is not passive, it is active. It is not laziness, it is the most intense kind of trust. It is choosing to relinquish your grip on control, to yield your plans, and to follow a path that is often unknown to the flesh but ordained by the Spirit. Throughout Scripture, God called people not simply to serve him, but to surrender first. Abraham was called to leave his country, his father's house, everything familiar. God did not show him the entire journey. He only gave him a promise. But in order to receive the promise, Abraham had to step into the unknown. He had to surrender his own understanding, his own logic, his own comfort, and it was in that surrender that he became the father of many nations. Moses had to surrender his past, his identity as a prince of Egypt, and later, even his limitations and fears. God did not use Moses while he was seated in Pharaoh's palace. He waited until Moses had been stripped of pride, until he no longer relied on his own strength, until he said, "Who am I that I should go?" In that humility, God said, "I will be with you." That is the pattern. When you surrender your strength, God gives you his. The mystery of surrender is also revealed in the story of Gideon. Gideon saw himself as the least of the least, hiding in the winepress, threshing wheat in fear. But God saw a mighty warrior. Before Gideon could lead Israel to victory, he had to tear down the altar of Baal in his own household. He had to surrender his family's idols, his community's approval, and his personal fear. And once he surrendered, God reduced his army, not increased it. Until only 300 remained, it made no sense in the natural, but God wasn't looking for natural strength. He was looking for supernatural surrender. And through it, he delivered an entire nation. Surrender also means letting go of your expectations of how God will use you. Many want to be laborers on their own terms, in ways that are visible, celebrated, or comfortable. But God's calling often leads through deserts before it leads to destiny. Joseph was given a dream of greatness, but the path led through betrayal, slavery, and prison. At every stage, Joseph could have resisted, fought back, or sought revenge. But he surrendered to the process. He remained faithful in obscurity, righteous in injustice, humble in authority. And in that surrender, God lifted him up and used him to preserve a generation. To be a co-laborer, your spirit must be in alignment with heaven. And alignment only comes through surrender. It is not enough to have the outward appearance of obedience while holding tightly to inner control. God is not looking for partial obedience or selective surrender. He is looking for those who will say, like Isaiah, "Here I am, send me without conditions, without bargaining, without delay." When Peter was called, he left his nets immediately. When Elisha was called, he slaughtered his oxen and burned his plow. These are not just acts of obedience. They are declarations of complete surrender. They burned the bridges back to their former lives, and in doing so, they stepped fully into the work of the kingdom. Surrender also requires the death of self, not in the sense of losing identity, but in the sense of laying down self-rule. Paul said, "I die daily." He understood that laboring with God was not a one-time decision, but a daily offering. Every day he surrendered his will, his rights, his desires, and because of that, the power of God flowed through him with boldness and authority. He didn't live by his own strength, but by the life of Messiah within him. This is the essence of surrender, not the absence of action, but action born out of submission. It is not striving to make things happen in your own power, but moving in step with the Spirit. When you surrender, you become a vessel that can carry His presence. The Holy Spirit does not fill what is already full of self. The oil of heaven flows into empty vessels, and it is in that emptiness, that yieldedness, that God does His greatest work. He gives revelation to the surrendered. He gives power to the yielded, He gives vision to the obedient, and through them He builds, He heals, He delivers, He restores. Surrender is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of His story written through your life.